It was 11:47 at night when Steph Curry found himself alone in the bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to process what had just happened. The silence of the house in Atherton seemed heavier than usual, loaded with the weight of a simple question that had shaken the foundations of everything he thought he knew about himself as a father. To understand how 8 innocent words from a child managed to break one of the strongest men in the world, we need to go back to that Tuesday night, when Steph discovered that there are questions that can forever change the way we see our own life. You can perceive that sometimes it's the simplest and most casual moments that carry the power to transform us completely. When a question asked, without malice, by someone we love, manages to penetrate all the defenses we've built, and forces us to confront truths we've spent our entire lives avoiding. A few hours earlier, the Curry house was wrapped in the typical family routine of a Tuesday night. The aroma of homemade dinner still lingered in the air. Isha had prepared roasted chicken seasoned with herbs she grew herself in the garden, accompanied by that mashed potato dish that always made the children ask for seconds. The sound of children's laughter echoed through the kitchen while Riley and Ryan told stories from school, their voices mixing in a domestic symphony that always brought peace to Steph's heart. It was one of those moments that Steph had learned to savor with particular intensity, not just because he knew how rare it was to have the whole family together without commitments or trips, but because there was something in the simplicity of these moments that made him feel he had managed to build exactly the kind of life he had always dreamed of having. Cannon, his 8-year-old son, was sitting beside him at the table, his eyes shining with that characteristic curiosity that always made Steph remember himself. At the same age, there was something special about Cannon, an emotional depth that sometimes surprised adults, a way of asking questions that went straight to the heart of things. "Dad," Cannon said, while Steph helped him finish his math homework after dinner, "can you tell me about real heroes?" Steph smiled, that kind of smile that appears naturally when a father realizes his son is entering one of those deep conversations that become precious memories years later. "What kind of heroes do you want to know about, champ?" "Heroes that really exist," Cannon responded with a seriousness that contrasted with his age. "Not the ones from movies. Real people who do brave things." How is it possible that an 8-year-old child can formulate questions that touch such fundamental aspects of human existence? Steph began talking about firefighters who save lives, doctors who heal people, teachers who change destinies, soldiers who protect countries. With each example, he saw Cannon's eyes light up with genuine admiration. "And you, Dad?" Cannon asked, after hearing several stories. "Are you a hero?" The question caught Steph off guard. He was used to public admiration, children asking for autographs, people saying he was an inspiration. But there was something in the direct and innocent way Cannon asked the question that made it different from anything he had ever heard. "Well," Steph said carefully, "I just play basketball, son. I don't know if that makes me a hero." "But you inspire people," Cannon insisted. "Mom said you show people they can achieve dreams if they work hard. Isn't that brave?" Something that touches deeply is when our own children make us see aspects of ourselves that we had lost sight of, when their innocent perspectives remind us of simple truths about impact and meaning that our adult modesty sometimes obscures. Steph felt a wave of affection for his son, for the way Cannon always managed to find deep meaning in things that Steph sometimes considered just work. "Maybe you're right, champ. Maybe we're all heroes in different ways." They continued talking as they went up to Cannon's room, Steph carrying him on his back through the hallways in a tradition they had developed since Cannon was too small to climb stairs alone. The familiar weight of his son, the sound of his laughter echoing through the corridors, the sensation of small arms wrapping around his neck. All of this created an atmosphere of security and love that Steph knew were the moments he truly lived for. In Cannon's room, while Steph helped him put on his pajamas and organize the toys scattered across the floor, the conversation about heroes continued naturally. Cannon was particularly fascinated by the idea that courage could manifest in different ways, sometimes saving people from fires, sometimes being kind to classmates at school, sometimes persevering when things got difficult. "Dad," Cannon said, while Steph tucked him into bed, "do all heroes have fear of something?" "Of course they do," Steph replied, sitting on the edge of the bed and smoothing his son's hair. "Actually, being afraid is part of what makes someone brave. Courage isn't not being afraid. It's doing the right thing even when you're scared." Cannon processed this information for a moment, his eyes reflecting the kind of serious contemplation that children sometimes demonstrate when they're trying to understand complex concepts about the adult world. Have you ever wondered how many times our children are processing life lessons much deeper than we imagine, absorbing not just our words but also our examples, building their own philosophies based on what they observe in us? "If even heroes are afraid," Cannon said slowly, "then everyone is afraid of something, right?" "Everyone," Steph confirmed. "It's part of being human." And that's when it happened. Cannon turned in bed to look directly into his father's eyes, with that intensity that children sometimes demonstrate when they're about to ask a question they consider very important. "Dad," he said with a soft but clear voice, "what is your biggest fear?" The world seemed to stop for a moment. Steph felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room, as if this simple and innocent question had somehow opened a door in his soul that he didn't even know existed. All the casual conversations about heroes and courage suddenly gained a weight he hadn't anticipated. Isn't it incredible how a question asked, without malice by someone we love can hit us with the force of a revelation, forcing us to confront aspects of ourselves that we've spent years avoiding examining too closely? Steph tried to keep the tone light, forcing a laugh that he hoped sounded more natural than it felt. "My biggest fear? That you don't brush your teeth, and all your teeth fall out." Cannon laughed, but there was something in his eyes that showed he wasn't satisfied with this evasive answer. Even at 8 years old, he had that disturbing ability to detect when adults were avoiding being completely honest. "No, Dad," Cannon said, with a seriousness that made Steph realize it wouldn't be possible to dodge the question. "Really? What is your biggest fear?" Steph felt his heart accelerate in a way he hadn't experienced in years. Not the familiar acceleration of adrenaline before an important game, but something much deeper and more frightening. It was as if Cannon had inadvertently touched an emotional wound that Steph didn't even know he was carrying. "Because I'm afraid of losing them, every moment becomes sacred." This phrase echoed in his mind from nowhere, as if some deep part of his consciousness was trying to answer the question before his rational mind could interrupt. "Son," Steph said carefully, trying to buy time while processing the unexpected emotional intensity that the question had triggered. "That's a very deep question. Let me think of an answer that does justice to the seriousness with which you asked, okay?" Cannon nodded, satisfied to finally have gotten a response that acknowledged the importance of his question. "Can you tell me tomorrow?" "I promise," Steph said, kissing his son's forehead. "I'll think carefully and give you an honest answer tomorrow." "Real promise?" Cannon insisted, extending his pinky in the familiar gesture they used to seal important commitments. "Real promise," Steph confirmed, intertwining his pinky with his son's in a ritual that suddenly seemed much more significant than all the other times they had done it. After turning off the lights and closing Cannon's bedroom door, Steph found himself standing in the hallway, his mind racing in ways he couldn't control. His son's simple question had stirred something deep in his psyche, something he apparently had spent years avoiding confronting directly. What was his biggest fear? The question echoed in his mind as he walked slowly back to his own room, where Isha was already sleeping peacefully. He had promised an honest answer, but he realized with growing discomfort that maybe he had never really allowed himself to think honestly about this question. What's most impressive is how sometimes we spend years building images of ourselves as brave and strong people, only to discover that there are fears so deep buried in our psyche that we didn't even know they were there, patiently waiting for an innocent question to bring them to the surface. Naturally, this leads us to question how many other truths about ourselves we're avoiding, how many fundamental aspects of our human experience we keep carefully out of our conscious examination until someone we love gently forces us to look deeper. And now Steph was alone in the bedroom, trembling slightly, not from cold, but from the disturbing realization that Cannon's question had opened something in his soul that he didn't know how to close again. Tomorrow he would have to find words for something he had perhaps never verbalized, not even to himself. For now, all he knew was that a simple question of 8 words had changed something fundamental in how he saw himself, his life, and what really mattered, and that the promise he had made to his son would force him on a journey of self-examination that he suspected would be much more difficult than any challenge he had ever faced on a basketball court. Because I'm afraid of losing them, every moment becomes sacred. The phrase returned to his mind, this time with the force of a truth he was finally ready to acknowledge, even though he wasn't yet ready to speak about it out loud. Until tomorrow. It was 2:15 in the morning when Steph realized he wouldn't be able to sleep. He had spent the last 2.5 hours lying next to Isha, watching the numbers on the digital clock change slowly, while his mind refused to quiet down. Cannon's question echoed in his head like a disturbing mantra, forcing him to confront emotional territories he had spent his entire adult life carefully avoiding. You can perceive that there are moments in life when a simple question triggers an avalanche of thoughts we can no longer control. When we discover that our mind was just waiting for permission to explore fears we had kept locked in dark compartments of our consciousness. With careful movements so as not to wake Isha, Steph got out of bed and walked barefoot through the silent hallway of his house. The wooden floor was cold under his feet, each step creating an almost imperceptible whisper that seemed amplified in the absolute quietude of the early morning. The house that during the day pulsed with familiar energy was now wrapped in an atmosphere of heavy contemplation, as if even the walls were waiting for him to find answers to questions he didn't know he needed to ask. Steph stopped at Cannon's bedroom door, pushing it slightly to peek at his son sleeping peacefully. The soft light from the hallway illuminated Cannon's relaxed face, his childish features, free from the curious intensity that had characterized his question a few hours earlier. There was something deeply touching about observing the absolute innocence of a child's sleep, that ability to rest completely without the weight of adult worries. How is it possible that someone so small and innocent can ask questions that shake the emotional foundations of an adult? Steph watched Cannon's soft and regular breathing, the almost imperceptible movement of his chest rising and falling, and felt an overwhelming wave of protective love mixed with something that took a few seconds to identify: pure terror. The realization hit Steph like a punch to the stomach. That was it. That was exactly what Cannon's question had triggered. The brutal and inescapable awareness of the fragility of everything he loved most in the world. Steph continued his nighttime walk through the house, stopping at each daughter's door. Riley, now 15 years old, slept with her phone still in her hand. Probably had fallen asleep talking to friends or watching videos. There was something both adorable and melancholic about seeing his oldest daughter in this transition between childhood and adolescence. Still small enough to need paternal protection, but old enough to begin navigating complexities of the adult world. Ryan, at 13 years old, was sprawled on the bed in a position that defied all laws of human anatomy. Blankets in complete disarray, hair covering half her face. Steph smiled, slightly recognizing in her the same physical intensity he demonstrated when he was a child. Always moving, always exploring limits, always living life with total energy. Something that touches deeply is the realization that each child carries unique aspects of our own personality, but also develops completely individual characteristics that surprise us and fill us with pride simultaneously. But as Steph watched his daughters sleep, the dark thoughts that Cannon's question had triggered began to take more definite shape. For the first time in his life, he allowed himself to imagine scenarios he had always kept firmly out of his conscious mind. What if something happened to him tomorrow? What if he had an accident going to practice? What if he discovered he had some serious illness that doctors hadn't detected in routine exams? What if, simply, his mortality, which he had always considered a distant abstraction, became an immediate reality? The questions multiplied in his mind like a geometric progression of anxiety. Would Cannon grow up without clear memories of his father? Would Riley navigate the challenges of adolescence without paternal guidance? Would Ryan develop her vibrant personality without having Steph there to celebrate each achievement and console her through each disappointment? Have you ever honestly contemplated what would happen to the people you love most if you were no longer present in their lives? It's one of the most terrifying thoughts a human being can have, but also one of the most universal. The awareness that our time with those we love is limited and precious precisely because of its temporary nature. Steph went downstairs slowly, his hands trembling slightly as he headed to the kitchen. He poured a glass of water, but realized he couldn't drink. His throat was constricted with emotion. He leaned against the counter and for the first time allowed thoughts he had spent his entire life avoiding to flow freely. He thought about Tyler Brooks, a childhood friend who had died in a car accident at 26 years old, leaving a young wife and a 6-month-old baby. He thought about James Wilson, a former teammate who had discovered pancreatic cancer at 32 and passed away within months. He thought about Anthony Jang, a neighbor who had suffered a heart attack while playing with his children in the backyard, without any prior warning. Why had he always automatically assumed he would be different? Why had he operated under the premise that he would have decades to be a father, to be present, to protect and guide his children? The brutal mathematics of mortality made no exceptions for successful people, beloved ones, or those who had important responsibilities. Naturally, this leads us to question whether we really value the time we have with our loved ones, or if we become so accustomed to their constant presence that we forget to treat them as the temporary and precious gifts they really are. Steph walked to the kitchen window and looked at the backyard where so many family memories had been created. He could almost hear echoes of his children's laughter when they were younger, playing tag among the trees, having picnics on the grass, learning to ride bicycles with his help and encouragement. Each memory now carried an emotional weight he had never perceived before. They weren't just happy moments from the past. They were finite treasures in a collection that would one day stop growing. Cannon's question had forced Steph to confront a truth that every father eventually needs to face. The time we have with our children is limited, and there are no guarantees about how much time we'll have. Because I'm afraid of losing them, every moment becomes sacred. The phrase returned to his mind with new intensity. But now Steph realized the phrase was incomplete. It wasn't just fear of losing them that made moments sacred. It was also, and perhaps mainly, the fear that they might lose him. What's most impressive is how we can live entire years unconsciously, assuming we'll always be available for the people who depend on us, until something forces us to confront the possibility that our presence in their lives is also temporary and not guaranteed. Steph returned to the living room and sat on the sofa where a few hours earlier he had been helping Cannon with his math homework. The contrast between the normalcy of that moment and the emotional intensity he was experiencing now was almost surreal. How had a simple question managed to open this Pandora's box of parental anxieties? He began to imagine conversations he might need to have with his children if he discovered he had limited time. How would he explain to Cannon that Daddy wouldn't always be there? How would he prepare Riley to navigate the challenges of adult life without continuous paternal guidance? How would he ensure that Ryan maintained her joy for living even if she faced the early loss of her father? The tears that Steph had been holding back finally began to fall. Not tears of sadness, but tears of a kind of existential terror he had never experienced before. It was as if Cannon's innocent question had removed a blindfold he didn't even know he was wearing, forcing him to see his own life through the lens of mortality. How many opportunities to create special memories with his children had he lost by being focused on work, trips, or simply assuming there would always be time for that later? How many important conversations had he postponed? How many intimate moments had he let pass? How many chances to be completely present had he wasted? Isn't it incredible how awareness of our own mortality can make us completely reevaluate our priorities, making us realize that the things we thought were important pale in comparison to the limited time we have with those we love? Steph looked at the clock, 3:47 in the morning. In a few hours, Cannon would wake up expecting an honest answer to his question. And for the first time, Steph had an answer that terrified him to give, but that he knew was completely true. His biggest fear wasn't failing professionally. It wasn't losing money or status. It wasn't even being judged negatively by the public. His biggest fear was dying before his children grew up, leaving them without the protection and guidance they deserved, not being present for the important moments of their lives. It was the fear that one day they would need him and he would no longer be there to answer. The sound of soft footsteps on the stairs interrupted his thoughts. Isha appeared in the living room, wearing a robe and with a worried expression on her face. "Steph? What are you doing awake? It's almost 4 in the morning." Steph looked at his wife, the woman he had chosen to build this beautifully imperfect life with, who had given birth to and helped raise these extraordinary children who were now the center of his greatest fears. How could he explain that a simple question from Cannon had triggered an existential crisis from which he didn't know how to recover? "Cannon asked me a question today," Steph said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "and I couldn't stop thinking about the answer." Isha sat beside him on the sofa, immediately detecting the emotional intensity he was carrying. After years of marriage, she had developed an almost telepathic ability to perceive when Steph was processing something deep. "What question was that?" she asked gently, placing a consoling hand on his arm. Steph breathed deeply, preparing to verbalize for the first time the fear he had discovered in the depths of his soul. "He asked what my biggest fear is," Steph said, the words coming out with difficulty. "And I realized I had never really thought about this before. But now I know." "And what is it?" Isha asked, although something in her voice suggested she already suspected the answer. Steph looked into his wife's eyes, seeing in them the reflection of his own fears. Because he knew that, on some level, she also carried the same anxieties about the precious fragility of the life they had built together. "Dying before seeing them grow up," he whispered, "leaving them without protection, without guidance, without knowing how much I love them. Because I'm afraid of losing them, every moment becomes sacred. But the complete truth was even more terrifying. Because they can lose me. Every moment in which I'm present becomes a sacred responsibility I cannot waste." The silence that followed his words was loaded with the weight of a truth they had both always known, but never verbalized. And Steph realized that, by giving voice to his greatest fear, he had also found his greatest motivation to live each day with the intensity and presence that this revelation deserved. It was 7:42 in the morning on a Wednesday that began like any other, but that would become a definitive milestone in the emotional history of the Curry family. Steph had slept only 2 hours after his early morning conversation with Isha, but strangely felt more alert than he had felt in months. It was as if confronting his greatest fear had removed a weight he didn't even know he was carrying, replacing it with a crystalline emotional clarity. The familiar aroma of freshly brewed coffee and homemade pancakes filled the kitchen, creating that atmosphere of morning comfort that always made Steph feel deep gratitude for the life he and Isha had built together. But today, every sensory detail seemed amplified. The sound of the girls' conversations preparing for school, the comforting rhythm of the family routine, the warmth of the morning sun entering through the windows. You can perceive that when we confront our own mortality, even the most common moments of domestic life gain a new emotional intensity, as if we were seeing our family through a lens that makes every interaction precious and meaningful. Cannon came downstairs wearing his favorite Warriors shirt, a miniature of his father's uniform that he insisted on wearing at least 3 times a week. His eyes still carried that adorable sleepiness of childhood, but Steph immediately noticed the exact moment when Cannon remembered the previous night's conversation. His eyes lit up with that mixture of curiosity and expectation that children demonstrate when they know they're going to receive something important. "Good morning, Dad," Cannon said, approaching for the morning hug that was an irremovable part of their routine. But this time, he pulled back slightly to look directly into his father's eyes. "Did you think of an answer to my question?" Steph felt his heart accelerate in a way that had nothing to do with caffeine or pre-game anxiety. It was the acceleration of someone who was about to do something he knew was necessary, but that he also knew would change something fundamental in his family's dynamic. "I did think, champ," Steph replied, his voice carrying a seriousness that made Cannon immediately realize this wouldn't be a casual answer. "And you know I always keep my promises, right?" "Always," Cannon confirmed, extending his pinky again in a gesture that had become a sacred ritual between them. Riley appeared in the kitchen at that moment, already dressed for school, but clearly still sleepy, followed by Ryan, who was carrying a backpack that seemed to contain enough school supplies for a week-long expedition. Isha was preparing school lunches with that maternal efficiency Steph had always admired, but he noticed she occasionally cast glances in his direction, a silent communication developed over years of marriage. How is it possible for someone to be simultaneously anxious to share something important and terrified by the consequences of doing so? Steph knew that the honest answer he had promised Cannon wasn't just about him. It was about the entire family confronting a reality about life and mortality that they might be too young to process completely. Actually, Steph said, making a decision he knew had no return, how about the whole family sits in the living room for a few minutes before you go to school? I'd like to share something important with all of you. The tone in Steph's voice made all morning activities stop instantly. Riley put down her phone, something that happened approximately never during mornings. Ryan stopped rummaging through her backpack. Isha turned off the stove. Cannon looked around, realizing he had somehow initiated something much bigger than a simple question between father and son. "Is everything okay, Dad?" Riley asked, her voice carrying that genuine concern that teenagers reserve for moments when they realize something serious is happening in the adult world. "Everything is okay," Steph assured, although his definition of okay was undergoing a complete revision. "Just something I'd like to share with you. Something important about family and about love." They headed to the living room, that space that had witnessed thousands of family moments. Movie nights, conversations about school problems, birthday celebrations, discussions about house rules. But Steph knew this moment would be different from all the others, that it would become one of those defining moments that families remember years later as before and after. Steph sat in the armchair that over the years had become officially his, while Isha settled on the sofa with the girls on each side. Cannon, with that instinctive awareness that children sometimes demonstrate for significant moments, chose to sit on the floor right in front of his father, as if he wanted to ensure he wouldn't miss a single word of the answer he had requested. Something that touches deeply is observing how families instinctively reorganize themselves spatially when they sense something important is about to be shared, creating physical configurations that facilitate emotional intimacy and genuine connection. "Last night," Steph began, his voice controlled but loaded with emotion, "Cannon asked me a question that I initially thought was simple, but that turned out to be one of the deepest questions anyone has ever asked me." He looked at each member of his family individually. Isha, whose eyes were already beginning to show understanding of what was to come. Riley, who was demonstrating that precocious emotional maturity that had always characterized her. Ryan, whose habitual energy had given way to focused attention. And Cannon, who was clearly trying to process whether he should feel proud or worried about having asked such an impactful question. "He asked what my biggest fear is," Steph continued, pausing to let the weight of the question settle. "And I realized that, in all my years as an adult, as a husband, as a father, I had never really thought honestly about this question." The silence in the room was so complete that Steph could hear the soft ticking of the wall clock, a sound that normally went unnoticed but now seemed to mark each second of a revelation that was about to forever change how his family saw life, love, and the temporary nature of both. Isn't it incredible how sometimes the most transformative moments of our lives happen not in dramatic or extraordinary settings, but in common family rooms with people we love, when we finally find the courage to be completely honest about truths we had been avoiding? "After thinking all night," Steph said, feeling tears beginning to form in his eyes, "I discovered what my biggest fear is, and it's something I've never said out loud before, not even to myself." The emotional intensity in Steph's voice made Isha extend her hand toward him in an instinctive gesture of support. Riley leaned slightly forward, her face showing an emotional maturity that sometimes surprised Steph. Ryan had stopped moving completely, her total attention focused on her father. Cannon remained sitting on the car floor, his big eyes fixed on Steph's face. "My biggest fear," Steph said, his voice beginning to tremble with emotion, "is dying before you grow up." The words hung in the air like a confession that changed everything. Steph saw the immediate impact on his family's faces, the instant understanding that he had just verbalized the most fundamental fear that any father carries, but that is rarely discussed openly. "My biggest fear," he continued, now with tears running freely down his face, "is not being here to protect you when you need me. It's losing the opportunity to see you graduate, get married, have your own children. It's leaving you without knowing completely how much I love you." Cannon was the first to start crying, not the dramatic crying of a child who got hurt, but silent tears of someone who was processing for the first time the reality that the people we love won't always be with us. It was as if the innocent question he had asked had opened a door to an understanding. About mortality he wasn't prepared to walk through. What's most impressive is how an honest confession about our deepest fears can simultaneously terrify and comfort those we love, offering them a new understanding about the intensity of our love for them. Riley was next, her tears falling as she processed the complete vulnerability her father was demonstrating. "Dad," she said with an emotional voice, "I never thought about this before, about you not always being here." Ryan, always the most emotionally expressive in the family, got up from the sofa and ran to hug Steph, her words coming out broken through sobs. "I don't want you to ever go away, Dad. Never." Isha was crying silently, but her tears carried a different quality. She was seeing her husband demonstrate a level of vulnerability that deepened her love for him in ways she hadn't anticipated. It was as if Steph had removed the last layer of emotional protection he had been maintaining between him and his family. "I know. It's scary to hear this," Steph said, pulling Ryan onto his lap while extending an arm to include Cannon in the hug. "But the reason I'm sharing this with you is that I want you to understand something important." He waited until everyone was looking at him again, their faces still wet with tears, but attentive to the message he was trying to transmit. "Because of this fear," Steph said, his voice gaining strength through the emotion, "every moment I spend with you becomes sacred to me. Every conversation, every laugh, every hug, every good night. All of this becomes precious, because I know our time together isn't infinite. Naturally, this leads us to understand that sometimes the most terrifying fears can transform into the most powerful motivations to love completely, to be intensely present, to not waste opportunities to connect with those who matter most. But I also want you to know," Steph continued, now embracing his entire family in a group hug that seemed to try to stop time, "that even though I have this fear, it won't prevent me from living fully. Actually, it will motivate me to live even more intensely, to love you even more deeply." Cannon, still processing the enormity of what he had triggered with his question, looked at his father through tears and said, "Dad, I'm also afraid of you going away." "And you know what, champ?" Steph replied, kissing the top of his son's head. "It's normal to have that fear. It means we love each other very much. And while we can't control everything that happens in life, we can control how we make the most of the time we have together." Riley, demonstrating emotional wisdom beyond her years, said through tears, "So we should try not to waste any moment, right?" "Exactly that," Steph confirmed. "We should love completely, be intensely present, and remind each other every day how important we are to each other. The family hug that followed was different from any other they had ever shared. It wasn't just affection, it was mutual recognition of the precious fragility of their time together. It was a silent promise to value every moment. It was transformation of fear into motivation to love even more deeply. Because I'm afraid of losing them, every moment becomes sacred. But now Steph understood the complete truth. Because we all fear losing each other, every moment we choose to love despite this fear becomes an act of courage that transforms terror into gratitude, anxiety into presence, and fear into strength to live each day as if it were a precious and temporary gift. What began as a devastating confession had transformed into something completely unexpected. A moment of family intimacy so deep that none of those present would ever forget. They remained embraced for several minutes, no one wanting to be the first to break the emotional connection that had formed through Steph's shared vulnerability. When they finally separated, there was something different in the air of the room. Not the heavy tension that precedes difficult revelations, but the lightness that comes after important secrets have been shared and accepted with love. It was as if Steph's brutal honesty had opened a door that none of them knew existed, creating a space where everyone felt safe to be completely authentic. You can perceive that sometimes the most transformative moments in a family's life happen when someone finds enough courage to be vulnerable first, creating permission for others to also remove their emotional masks and share their own deep truths. Cannon was the first to speak, his voice still a little shaky, but loaded with an emotional maturity that surprised even himself. "Dad, I have a confession too." Steph leaned toward his son, recognizing that Cannon had not only asked a transformative question, but was now prepared to participate in the honest conversation his question had initiated. "I also have fears," Cannon said, looking directly into his father's eyes with a seriousness that contrasted with his age. "I'm afraid of not being brave enough when I grow up. I'm afraid of disappointing you. And now I'm afraid that you'll go away before I can show that I can be strong like you." Cannon's raw honesty hit Steph like a wave of love and paternal pride. Here was his 8-year-old son, processing complex fears about growth, expectations, and mortality with an emotional eloquence that many adults never develop. "Champ," Steph said, pulling Cannon closer, "you're already one of the bravest people I know. The courage you showed asking that question last night, and the courage you're showing now sharing your fears, that's real strength." Riley moved restlessly on the sofa for a moment before finding her own voice. "Can I share mine too?" Isha nodded encouragingly, recognizing that something extraordinary was happening. Their family was discovering a new way to connect through emotional honesty that went far beyond their typical conversations. "I'm afraid of not being smart enough," Riley confessed, fresh tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Everyone always says I'm Steph Curry's daughter, and I'm afraid I'll never be able to do something important on my own. And I'm afraid you'll discover I'm not as special as you think." How is it possible that a 15-year-old teenager already carries the weight of expectations that could crush her if not addressed carefully and with love? Steph felt a pang of recognition. He knew intimately the pressure of living up to a public image, of carrying other people's expectations. "Riley," Steph said, his voice loaded with absolute conviction, "you're already extraordinary, not because of me, but because of who you choose to be every day. Your kindness, your intelligence, your compassion, these things come from within you, not from any connection to me." Ryan, who until that moment had remained characteristically quiet during a serious conversation, suddenly exploded with her own confession. "I'm afraid you don't take me seriously because I'm the youngest. I have important ideas and important feelings, but sometimes I feel like you think I'm just the baby of the family." The emotional intensity in Ryan's voice made the whole family realize she had been carrying this feeling for much longer than anyone had noticed. It was a powerful reminder that even the youngest children have complex emotional lives that deserve to be taken seriously. Something that touches deeply is discovering that when we create safe spaces for family vulnerability, each member, regardless of age, has emotional depths and legitimate fears that need to be recognized and honored. "Ryan," Isha said, getting up to hug her youngest daughter, "you're never just anything to us. You're Ryan, unique, important, and always taken seriously. We love you not despite your age, but including everything you are right now." The moment had come for Isha to share her own fears, and everyone in the room seemed to recognize, intuitively, that her contribution would be different. The perspective of a mother and wife who had observed this family grow and develop through challenges and celebrations. "My biggest fear," Isha said, her voice controlled but emotionally loaded, "is that I'm not giving you everything you deserve as a mother. I'm afraid that my own career sometimes takes attention away from you. And I have the same fear as Dad, that something might happen to me and I won't be here to see you become the incredible adults I know you'll be." Isha's confession completed a circle of vulnerability that had completely transformed the room's dynamic. Each family member had removed layers of emotional protection, creating an intimacy none of them had experienced before. What's most impressive is how mutual honesty about our deepest fears can create family bonds that are stronger than any connection based only on happy moments or shared successes. Steph looked around the room, seeing his family through a completely new lens. They weren't just the people he loved. They were brave companions on a shared human journey, each carrying legitimate fears, each deserving love that included their vulnerabilities instead of requiring them to hide them. "You know what?" Steph said, his voice gaining strength as a powerful realization formed. "I spent so much time trying to be the strong father, the hero who never has fear, that I almost lost the opportunity to teach you the most important thing of all." "What thing?" Cannon asked, still processing all the revelations that had been shared. "That being human, having fears, having vulnerabilities, needing each other, this doesn't make us weak. This makes us real. And real relationships, real love, real family. All of this is only possible when we're brave enough to be completely honest about who we really are. Naturally, this leads us to understand that true strength doesn't come from pretending we don't have fears, but from loving each other. Through the fears, from creating safe spaces where vulnerability is received with compassion instead of judgment." Riley, demonstrating the emotional wisdom that was becoming her trademark, made an observation that surprised even her. "It's like we were all pretending to be stronger than we are, but when we stopped pretending, we discovered we're stronger together than any of us imagined being alone." "Exactly that," Steph confirmed, feeling paternal pride of an intensity he hadn't experienced before. "And you know what else? Now that we all know each other's fears, we can help each other be brave when it's difficult." Cannon, always practical despite his emotional depth, asked, "How do we do that?" "We start by reminding each other every day how important we are to each other," Isha suggested. "We stop assuming that the people we love know we love them. We say it out loud. And we create special traditions," Ryan added, her characteristic energy returning as she processed the possibilities. "Things we do together that remind us how lucky we are to have each other. And when someone is afraid, Riley contributed. Instead of saying not to be afraid, we can say we understand the fear and that we'll face it together. Steph felt tears of gratitude beginning to form in his eyes as he realized that Cannon's devastating question had not only revealed his deepest fears, but had transformed his family into a stronger, more honest, and more connected unit than they had ever been. "Do you know what I discovered today?" Steph said, embracing his family once more in a collective hug that seemed to seal the promises they were making to each other. "What?" all voices asked in chorus. "I discovered that my biggest fear is also my greatest blessing. Because I'm afraid of losing you, I love you more intensely. Because I know our time together is precious, I value every moment. Because you're so important to me that even the idea of living without you terrifies me, I know I'm living a life worth living." Isn't it incredible how the fears that most haunt us frequently point directly to the things we value most, and how recognizing this connection can transform anxiety into gratitude, terror into appreciation? And do you know what's the most incredible part of all this? Steph continued, looking at each member of his family individually. Now that we no longer have secrets about our fears, we can use all the energy we spent hiding them to love each other even more. Completely. Cannon, the innocent initiator of all this transformation, made a final observation that would become one of the most repeated family quotes in the years that followed. So being brave isn't not being afraid. It's loving someone so much that you're brave, even when you're scared. "Perfect, champ," Steph said, kissing the top of his son's head. "You just summarized one of the most important lessons about what it means to be human." And so, what had begun as a simple question from a curious child became a defining moment in the emotional history of the Curry family. They had discovered that shared vulnerability creates deeper connections than any external success or achievement, that recognized and accepted fears lose much of their power over us, and that stronger families are built not on the absence of fear, but on the courage to love completely despite fear. In the months that followed, the Curry family would become known not only for Steph's successes on the courts, but for their honesty about the emotional realities of building authentic relationships. They began weekly traditions of vulnerability check-ins, where each member could share fears, concerns, or gratitudes without judgment. More importantly, they discovered that when they stopped trying to be a perfect family and began being a real family, complete with fears, vulnerabilities, and normal human imperfections, they became exactly the kind of family they had always wanted to be, a safe place where each person could be completely known and completely loved. "Because I'm afraid of losing them, every moment becomes sacred." This phrase became not just Steph's personal revelation, but a family mantra that reminded them daily that true love doesn't exist, despite life's fragility, but because of it. That each good morning and each good night is a temporary gift. That every shared laugh, every consoled tear, every moment of complete presence with each other is a victory over fear. Not because it eliminates the possibility of loss, but because it chooses to love completely, despite that possibility. And Cannon never stopped asking deep questions, but now he knew his family was a safe place where any question, no matter how challenging or scary, would be received with honesty, love, and the collective courage to face any truth together.